In the year 1982, off a jagged promontory along Turkey's southern shoreline, a sponge diver navigating the deep underwater cliffs felt his air hose catch on something in the darkness beneath him. He came close to severing it. Underwater explorers lose equipment on the ocean floor constantly, and at 150 feet down, with sunlight virtually extinguished, you do not pause to examine every obstruction that snags your line. Yet he glanced downward, and what had ensnared his hose was not stone. It was the rim of a metallic bar shaped like an elongated animal hide, resting among a cluster of identical ones, partially buried in 30 centuries of accumulated seabed material, the remains of a vessel that had foundered while Egyptian pharaohs still held dominion, and Troy's fortifications remained intact. What they retrieved from that ocean floor over the subsequent 10 years became the most significant Bronze Age maritime discovery ever documented. 10 tons of copper piled in standardized ingots, the foundational metal of an entire epoch resting on the Mediterranean floor since before Rome existed as a settlement. Then the laboratory scientists began their examination. Because copper possesses a distinctive signature, the isotopic proportions locked within the trace back to its geological origin, and they anticipated the answer would be Cyprus, Sardinia, or the Sinai Peninsula, the established sources that supplied the ancient world. The majority corresponded accordingly. A measurable portion did not. It failed to match Cyprus. It failed to correspond with any documented deposit anywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere that specialists could identify. The copper had originated somewhere, a genuine excavation site with a verifiable chemical profile, and the sole location on Earth where a deposit sufficiently extensive and refined enough to account for the portion that failed to correspond lay 4,000 miles distant across an ocean that the vessel's builders were never believed to have navigated, beneath a North American lake. This narrative concerns the source of that copper and the people who, on the opposite side of the world, still recalled loading it aboard ships. Before proceeding further, you must comprehend why a 3,000-year-old piece of copper can be identified at all, because this element transforms the entire question into something demonstrable rather than speculative. When copper forms geologically, it incorporates a specific ratio of lead isotopes, atoms of the same element possessing marginally different masses. That proportion is determined by the geological characteristics of the particular deposit, the specific age and composition of the surrounding stone. Two copper sources may appear indistinguishable to the naked eye, yet carry entirely divergent isotopic fingerprints. Moreover, those fingerprints endure smelting processes, casting procedures, even millennia of submersion on the ocean floor. Consequently, when archaeometallurgists examine a Bronze Age ingot, they are not hypothesizing. They are interpreting a chemical identifier and comparing it against an archive of no-nor bodies. For the majority of the Uluburun copper, the identification was conclusive. Cyprus predominantly the prominent copper island of the ancient Mediterranean basin. However, the methodology operates in both directions. The same analytical precision that verifies a Cypriot origin for the bulk of the shipment is precisely what identifies the remainder as non-Cypriot, non-Sardinian, not matching any documented Old World excavation site. This represents neither an insignificant irregularity nor a statistical aberration. It constitutes a quantifiable proportion of the metal whose fingerprint points away from every source the ancient Mediterranean is documented to have utilized. Moreover, a fingerprint corresponding to nothing in the existing records does not conclude the investigation, initiates one. Because the copper did not materialize from nothingness, it originated from an actual location that simply remains undocumented in the scholarly literature. Now, the legitimate counter-argument, because a thorough examination presents the conventional explanation in its strongest form before evaluating it. Mainstream archaeology offers a reasonable interpretation for that unexplained portion, and it does not involve the Americas. Rather, it proposes that our reference collection of Old World copper sources remains incomplete, that ancient excavations existed in Anatolia, the Balkans, the Caucasus Mountains, or elsewhere that were exhausted, abandoned, and never scientifically sampled, rendering their isotopic profiles simply missing from the comparative dataset. Under this interpretation, the unattributed copper is not foreign at all. It represents regional copper from an unidentified source, and the gap reflects deficiencies in our documentation, not in our geography. This constitutes a valid argument, and it could well account for some portion of the metal. Mines disappeared, records remain fragmentary, and no responsible investigator should dismiss this possibility. Yet observe what this explanation demands and what it leaves unaddressed. It necessitates an unidentified Old World deposit sufficiently productive to contribute to international commerce, yet vanished so thoroughly that it left no waste heaps, no excavated areas, no cultural memory, and no isotopic equivalent anywhere subsequently sampled. Furthermore, even accepting all of that, it fails to address the complementary aspect of the puzzle, the dimension completely unrelated to this particular wreck, because across the Atlantic in North America there exists the precise inverse mystery. Not missing copper, but missing excavators. A deposit stripped on an industrial scale with no one recorded in the historical text to have accomplished it. Set aside the shipwreck momentarily and traverse the Atlantic, because the other portion of this puzzle was waiting in Michigan's soil long before anyone examined any ingot. The Upper Peninsula and Isle Royale sit atop one of Earth's most remarkable copper formations. Not ore requiring smelting, but pure elemental copper. Metal you can forge into a tool immediately after extracting it, occurring in masses weighing thousands of pounds, and when American mining enterprises arrived during the 1840s to develop it, they discovered they were not the first occupants. The terrain had already been excavated. Ancient shafts cut into solid bedrock approximately 60 feet deep, featuring drainage systems and the decayed remnants of timber supports, along with stone hammers scattered by the tens of thousands. Geologists calculated that the deposit had originally contained somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of accessible native copper, and that a substantial quantity had simply disappeared, extracted during antiquity by unidentified workers and transported elsewhere. Radiocarbon measurements obtained from timber in those ancient excavations fall squarely within the Bronze Age period and the surrounding centuries. Consequently, here are the two components arranged side by side. In the Mediterranean region, a fraction of Bronze Age copper whose fingerprint corresponds to no documented Old World source. In Michigan, a Bronze Age deposit of pure copper mined on an industrial scale by people who abandoned the pits and the implements, yet removed the metal and disappeared from the historical record. Mainstream scholarship can individually explain either component. The difficulty emerges when you attempt to reconcile them together. Here is the principle that transforms two separate puzzles into a unified case. When independent lines of evidence collected by individuals who were not collaborating converge upon the same conclusion, that convergence carries more weight than any single line alone. We have thus far two physical lines. The first concerns the isotopic fraction in the Uluburan cargo that corresponds to no documented Old World mine and whose profile is consistent with Lake Superior native copper, a claim that is legitimate, published, and, in fairness, disputed, with serious researchers questioning the match and proposing undocumented regional sources instead. The second concerns the physical reality of the Michigan mines. Billions of pounds of native copper industrially extracted during the Bronze Age timeframe, the overwhelming majority absent from the North American archaeological record, where ceremonial usage accounts for only a minuscule fraction. Neither line was constructed to support the other. The chemist measuring lead isotopes in Turkey was not contemplating Michigan. The geologist mapping excavated pits in the Upper Peninsula was not contemplating a shipwreck. Yet they describe complementary halves of a single exchange. Copper extracted in enormous quantity on one continent and unaccounted for there, and copper arriving in enormous quantity on another continent from an unidentified source there. A supply without a documented destination on one side of the ocean, a demand satisfied by an unrecognizable source on the other. Furthermore, there exists a third line, one that owes nothing to chemistry or geology whatsoever, because the inhabitants who resided atop those Michigan mines were questioned and they responded. In 1894, accounts of Ojibwe oral tradition concerning the ancient mines were compiled and preserved through institutional channels, documented, not fabricated, by observers operating within the standard scholarly practices of that period. The Ojibwe homeland was situated directly upon the copper region, and if any community preserved knowledge of who had worked it, it would be them. What the elders described was not a mythological narrative. It constituted an account of a people, physical, historical, distinct in appearance from any group the Ojibwe recognized from their own ancestral memory, who had preceded them, organized and intentional, who knew precisely where the copper lay and removed it in quantities the tradition explicitly characterized as enormous. Furthermore, the accounts agree, with remarkable consistency, on two details that should give you pause given everything already presented. The copper people arrived from the east, from across the Great Water, and when their work was complete, they placed the copper onto watercraft and departed, returning the same way they had come. Hold that against the remainder of the evidence. The isotopes indicate that a fraction of Mediterranean copper originated from a source across the ocean. The excavations indicate that the Michigan deposit was stripped by unidentified individuals during the Bronze Age, and the Ojibwe, with no knowledge of isotopes or ingots, independently described as seafaring people who came from the east, extracted the copper, loaded it onto ships, and sailed back the way they had come. 3 lines, 3 methodologies, no coordination, and they all point toward the same narrative. An objective individual naturally asks the obvious question. If a trade route connected the Mediterranean to a North American lake for centuries, where is the documentation of it on the Old World side? The answer, if one exists, may not be silence by coincidence, but silence by intention. The great maritime merchants of the ancient world, the Phoenicians above all, were not in the business of broadcasting their supply chains. Their prosperity depended upon monopoly, upon being the sole possessors of knowledge regarding a valuable material's origin. Their captains were, according to surviving accounts, bound by oath to maintain route secrecy, instructed to destroy their own vessels rather than permit a rival to trace their path to the source. A trade route functions as a trade secret. If a Bronze Age maritime power had discovered a method of crossing the Atlantic to a copper deposit of almost limitless richness, the last action they would take would be to document it where a competitor could access that information. The route would be protected, encoded, transmitted orally. When that civilization collapsed, the secret would collapse alongside it, leaving only fragments. A legend of tin islands in the Western Ocean, a cryptic reference to territories beyond the straits, a metal of unknown origin in a submerged hold. Absence of explicit documentation is precisely what a protected trade secret appears like 3 millennia later. The silence does not constitute evidence that nothing occurred. In an era that would eliminate individuals to safeguard a shipping lane, silence represents the sound of successful secrecy. Consequently, reduce the case to what can be expressed directly, because the direct version carries sufficient weight independently. A Bronze Age vessel founded off Turkey carrying 10 tons of copper retrieved from the seabed beginning in 1982. This is documented and undisputed. Isotopic examination matched the majority of that copper to Cyprus and identified a measurable fraction as corresponding to no documented Old World source. The proposition that this fraction is consistent with Lake Superior copper is legitimate and published, and it is vigorously contested. Across the ocean, the Michigan copper region demonstrates ancient industrial-scale mining during the Bronze Age timeframe, with the overwhelming majority of the extracted metal absent from the North American record. The Ojibwe, the inhabitants of that territory, preserved and recorded in 1894 an account of a seafaring people who arrived from the east, extracted the copper, placed it aboard vessels, and departed. The maritime powers of the ancient Mediterranean are documented to have protected their trade routes with lethal confidentiality. None of this individually constitutes proof. The isotope match may ultimately resolve to an undiscovered Old World mine. The Ojibwe account may describe something the chemistry will never confirm, yet the convergence is genuine and it is disquieting. A supply, a demand, a memory, and a rationale for concealment, all pointing across the same ocean. Mainstream scholarship can individually dismantle any one of these threads. What it has never accomplished is explaining why all 4 align in the same direction. There exists a passage in the 1894 record that resonates differently once you have followed the copper across the entire ocean. Describing the conclusion of the copper people's presence, an Ojibwe elder stated that they took what they had come for, and then the lake fell silent. For an extended period, that constituted the entirety. A silent lake, an emptied deposit, a memory with nothing to connect to except the cavities in the earth and the stone implements left behind. The metal itself had vanished, dispersed into a world that did not document its origin, its trail obliterated by distance and confidentiality and 3 millennia. The lake forgot, because the lake represented merely the commencement of the voyage. Yet the copper did not stop at the shoreline. It proceeded onto the water, and some portion, if the fingerprint signifies what it appears to signify, travelled across that water all the way to the Mediterranean floor, where it remained within a sunken hull through the ascent and decline of every civilization that followed, preserving its chemical signature intact while the individuals who extracted it became a sentence in an obscure document. The lake fell silent. The sea, it transpires, was not equally forgetful. Within the catalogued cargo of the most extensively examined shipwreck in history, a fraction of the metal continues to indicate its origin across 4 Zewan miles of ocean, pointing toward a deposit beneath a North American lake and toward a people who informed us, more than a century ago, precisely what had occurred, and were not believed, count the ingots. The majority originated from Cyprus. It is the ones that did not that this narrative concerns.